Julia and Mark's house was shrouded in a nearly palpable calm, a tranquility that contrasted with the unease growing in Julia's heart. The soft light of the lamp illuminated the room, casting shadows on the walls as she arranged the sofa cushions. The evening routine was in progress. Mark had just taken a shower and was now getting ready for bed, oblivious to the storm brewing in his wife's mind. "Are you still awake, dear?" Mark asked, emerging from the bathroom with a towel around his waist, his hair still wet. He seemed relaxed, while Julia, on the other hand, felt a growing pressure in her chest. "I'm just tidying up a few things," Julia replied, trying to keep her voice light. But there was a tension in her expression that Mark didn't notice. He approached and kissed her on the forehead, a gesture that should have been comforting, but now felt empty. As they headed to the bedroom, Julia couldn't shake the strange feeling that followed her. The unease trailed her like a shadow, and she wondered, what had changed between them? What was happening in her life that she couldn't identify? What once seemed like a solid marriage now felt like a facade, and it made her anxious. In the bedroom, Mark settled into bed, turning on the television to find something to relax with. Julia, on the other hand, decided to check social media on her phone, but her eyes were drawn to Mark's phone, which was on the nightstand. A notification appeared on the screen, illuminating the room with an unexpected glow. The urge to check the message was like a magnetic force she couldn't resist. Julia hesitated, her heart racing. "It's just a message," she thought, trying to convince herself she wasn't doing anything wrong. But an inner voice warned her, what if you discover something you don't want to know? With a quick movement, she grabbed the phone and unlocked the screen. Her heart pounded as she read the words she never expected to find. Loving messages, full of affection and promises, written by a woman named Sarah. "It can't be," Julia murmured, her voice faltering. The words danced before her eyes, each one cutting deeper than the last. Reality was unfolding into a nightmare from which she couldn't wake up. The promises of eternal love that Mark had made now seemed like a cruel joke. When Mark entered the room, Julia stared at him, anger and pain mixing in her gaze. The phone was still in her hands, and she didn't know how to start unraveling the truth that was now before her. "What are you doing with my phone?" Mark asked, noticing the disturbed expression on his wife's face. There was a tone of disdain in his voice, as if he already knew the answer she didn't want to give. Julia took a deep breath, her voice trembling with emotion. "Who is Sarah?" The question came out as a whisper, but there was a weight that seemed to echo in the air. Mark hesitated, his gaze shifting for a moment. "Sarah? She's just a colleague from work, Julia. It has nothing to do with you." At that moment, Mark's denial sounded like a sharp blade. Julia felt anger growing inside her. She knew she was facing a sea of lies, and the hope she once had in her marriage was quickly fading. "You're lying to me," Julia shouted, her voice rising. "I saw the messages, Mark. You can't just ignore this." Mark tried to avert his eyes, but the truth was exposed between them like an insurmountable chasm. The silence that followed was deafening, and Julia felt the pain of betrayal enveloping her like a chain. She was devastated, the image of the man she loved crumbling before her eyes. I didn't want you to find out like this," Mark finally muttered, his voice faltering. But the confession offered no solace. What was once love now seemed like a game of illusions, and Julia realized she needed to face this new reality, even if it meant confronting the truth in a way she didn't yet understand. Julia arrived at Lisa's house with a heavy heart and a tumultuous mind. The door opened quickly, and her friend hugged her tightly. The familiar smell of fresh coffee and warm cookies welcomed Julia, but the feeling of comfort seemed distant. They sat on the couch, and Julia couldn't help the tears that streamed down her face. "I don't know what to do, Lisa," Julia said, her voice breaking. "Mark, he cheated on me with a woman named Sarah." "Oh my God, Julia," Lisa replied, her expression of shock quickly turning to concern. "Are you sure? It can't just be a misunderstanding. I read the messages. There's no way it's a misunderstanding." Julia pulled out her phone and showed the screen to Lisa, who stared intently, fury growing in her eyes. "He promised eternal love, and now this." Lisa took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "You need to take care of yourself. This is devastating, but you can't let this define you. You deserve to be happy." Happy? How can I be happy knowing he was with another woman? Julia felt lost, as if a part of her had been torn away. We need to find out who this Sarah is, Lisa said, determined. We can't just let this slide. You need to know the truth. As they talked, Julia felt a spark of determination ignite within her. You're right. I can't just sit here suffering. I need to find out more about this woman, who she is, and what she represents in Mark's life. I'll help you with that, Lisa affirmed, winking at her friend. We'll do some investigating. You have social media, right? Let's look for her. Julia nodded, a mix of fear and adrenaline coursing through her body. Right. I'm going to need you by my side. The two sat together in front of the computer. The screen's light reflected the anxiety on their faces as Julia typed Sarah's name into social media. Images began to appear, and each new photo was a blow to her heart. Sarah was beautiful, with a charming smile and an aura of confidence that Julia couldn't ignore. Look at this, Julia murmured, showing a photo of Sarah at a party, surrounded by friends. She looks so happy and successful. What did Mark see in me when he has someone like that? Julia, don't compare yourself, Lisa said, placing a hand on her friend's shoulder. She may have the looks, but you have something she probably doesn't, a genuine heart and a strength that I admire. You'll get through this. But Lisa's words didn't ease the insecurity growing inside Julia. Every new piece of information they found about Sarah seemed to tear at her self-esteem even more. She's an executive, seems to have a perfect life. How am I going to compete with that? You don't need to compete. You're unique, and that's what matters. Mark doesn't know what he's losing. You're an incredible woman, and he doesn't see it now, but he will, Lisa replied, trying to calm her. Julia took a deep breath, trying to regain some of her confidence. It wasn't just about Sarah, it was about her too. I can't just sit here suffering. I need to face the truth. I can't be a victim forever. That's right. We'll find out everything we can about this woman and what Mark is really doing. You're strong, Julia, and we'll do this together. Julia's determination grew. The pain of betrayal still consumed her, but now there was a thread of hope, an unwavering desire to regain control of her life. She would no longer live in the shadow of lies and betrayals. The truth would come out, and no matter what happened, she was ready to face whatever came her way. Julia was nervous as she finished preparing dinner. The table was carefully set, with candles lit that cast a soft light over the food she had prepared. She wanted everything to seem normal, as if she were just celebrating another evening with Mark. But inside, her mind was in turmoil. The messages she had read on his phone wouldn't leave her mind. Sarah, the woman who had invaded her life, had become the shadow over every thought Julia had. I can't let him see my pain, she thought as she put the finishing touch on the salad. When Mark arrived home, Julia forced a smile. He, apparently, didn't notice the tension in the air. Hi, love. What did you make for dinner? He asked casually as he headed to the table. A little bit of everything. I hope you're hungry, Julia replied, her voice controlled. Did you have a tiring day at work? Yes, it was tough. But now that I'm here, everything feels better, he said, pulling out a chair. Mark seemed unconcerned, and this only heightened the anger boiling inside her. As she served dinner, Julia took the opportunity to ask subtle questions. How did the project with Sarah go? Did you manage to close that deal? Mark hesitated for a moment, but quickly smiled. Oh yes, she's a great colleague, really dedicated. But there's nothing you need to worry about, he said, avoiding eye contact. This averted gaze didn't go unnoticed by Julia. I'm not worried, she stated, forcing herself to keep her voice steady. Just curious, you know. It's good to know you work with competent people. The conversation continued, but each question Julia asked felt like a dagger in her heart. She wanted Mark to see the pain he was causing, but at the same time, she wanted to be smart about it. And how are the other colleagues? Anyone new on the team? She asked, looking for any clue that could confirm her suspicions. Oh yes, a few new hires, but nothing you need to worry about. Everything is under control, he said with a smile that seemed a little nervous. Julia felt a wave of anger rising inside her, but she took a deep breath to calm down. Of course, she said, trying to keep the tone light. You know I trust you, right? Yes, of course, Mark replied, but Julia could feel the hesitation in his words. Dinner continued in a tense atmosphere, with Julia doing her best to keep the conversation flowing, but her mind was far away. The image of Sarah, the stranger who had insinuated herself into her life, wouldn't leave her head. After dinner, while washing the dishes, Julia reflected on what to do next. With each dish she scrubbed, she felt her determination growing. "I'm not a victim," she thought. "I need to find out the truth." When she finally finished, she turned to Mark, who was watching TV. "Mark, I need to talk to you about something serious," she said, her voice now more firm. He turned, surprised. "Sure, what is it?" he asked, but there was a slight shadow of concern in his eyes. "I need to know more about Sarah. I can't stop thinking about her," Julia declared, feeling like she was finally laying her cards on the table. Mark frowned, visibly uncomfortable. "Why are you so worried about that? She's just a colleague from work, Julia. Nothing to worry about." "Do you really think I'm going to believe that? The messages I found, Mark, I can't ignore them," she said, her voice almost trembling. "Julia, please, let's not start with this again. There's no reason for you to be like this," he replied, trying to steer the conversation away once again. "But I want to know the truth," Julia insisted, her determination growing with every word. "I'm tired of lies." Mark looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and fear. "You really want to know? Then you'll discover it's a storm you're not ready to face," he said, his tone more severe. Julia felt a chill down her spine, but instead of backing down, she felt stronger. "I want to face it, Mark. I need to know what's going on." And so, when dinner ended and the tension hung in the air, Julia found herself more determined than ever to uncover the truth about Sarah, even if it meant diving into an abyss that could change everything. Julia entered the cafe with a racing heart. The elegant decor and the aroma of fresh coffee couldn't calm the storm brewing inside her. She sat at a table in a corner where she could observe the entrance. With each passing minute, her anxiety grew. What would she say to Sarah? How would the woman who had destroyed her world react to knowing she was about to face the wife of the man she loved? When Sarah finally appeared, Julia couldn't suppress a shiver. The woman was stunning, with wavy hair cascading over her shoulders and a smile that seemed to light up the room. However, Julia also noticed something else, an expression of curiosity and confusion as Sarah looked around, as if trying to find the reason for this meeting. "Hi, you're Julia, right?" Sarah said, approaching the table with a friendly but cautious tone. "Yes, it's me. Thanks for coming," Julia replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "We need to talk." The air between them was thick with tension. Sarah sat down, and an awkward silence settled in. Julia took a deep breath, trying to gather courage. I saw the messages between you and Mark," Julia began, without beating around the bush. Sarah's expression changed instantly, and Julia noticed a flicker of surprise in the woman's eyes. "What do you mean by that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't understand." "He's my husband," Julia said, the pain and anger evident in her words. The messages were very personal. Sarah remained silent, looking down, clearly processing the information. Julia watched the woman, noticing the vulnerability she hadn't seen before. What did she expect? That Sarah would be a cold villain? Now, she seemed more like a victim of the same man. "I didn't know," Sarah finally said, her voice almost a whisper. "Mark never mentioned that he was married. He told me he was separated." Julia felt a wave of confusion and compassion. How could Mark do this? He played with the feelings of both of them, manipulating them with his lies. "So, you didn't know anything? You really believed him?" "Yes," Sarah replied, frustration beginning to show. "I was naive. I thought he was being honest. He seemed so passionate." Julia shook her head, fighting the urge to scream. "He's a liar, and I don't know what to do with this now. It's like everything has fallen apart. I'm not just the betrayed wife. I'm a woman who no longer recognizes her life." Sarah's gaze changed, and Julia realized that the woman was also dealing with her own emotions. "I'm sorry for all of this. It wasn't my intention to hurt you. I didn't know." "And now?" Julia asked, the anger beginning to fade, giving way to a deep exhaustion. "What are you going to do?" Sarah hesitated, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't know. I thought I had found someone special, and now everything has fallen apart in an instant. I don't want to be seen as the mistress, but I can't just ignore what happened." The two women looked at each other, each trying to understand the other's pain. Julia felt a strange camaraderie forming between them, despite the situation. It was as if they were both prisoners of a man who played with their feelings. Maybe we should join forces, Julia suggested, the idea forming in her mind. If he's a liar, we should expose him, not just for us, but so no one else suffers like we have. Sarah seemed to ponder the proposal. You're right. I don't want to be a victim. I want the truth to come out. He needs to face the consequences of his actions. Julia felt a new purpose growing inside her. The pain of betrayal still consumed her, but now there was a spark of determination. As she left the cafe, the cool night breeze enveloped her, and the feeling of being a victim was beginning to fade. She would no longer allow Mark to control her. Julia was about to change the game. Julia was sitting in a circle of chairs, surrounded by strangers who, like her, were seeking comfort in a support group. The room was lit by soft light, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the air. It was there, in that welcoming space, that she began to rebuild herself. Every word shared among the participants seemed like a thread of hope being woven into her shattered soul. I used to think that love was all we needed, said a woman with disheveled hair, tears in her eyes. But when I found out I was deceived, I realized I needed to find myself first. Julia felt a knot tighten in her chest. Those stories resonated with her pain. As the session ended, she approached the woman. "Do you feel stronger now?" she asked, seeking a spark of inspiration. "Yes, though it's a long journey," the woman replied, wiping her tears with her sleeve. "But discovering who I am without him has given me a power I never knew I had." Her words echoed in Julia's mind. What did she really want? It wasn't just revenge against Mark, but also rediscovery of herself. She decided she would no longer be a victim. Instead, she would become the protagonist of her own story. In the days that followed, Julia dedicated herself to exploring her forgotten passions. She began painting again, something she hadn't done since her teenage years. The vibrant colors and loose strokes became a way of expressing her pain, her anger, and gradually her liberation. One sunny morning, while immersed in painting, the phone rang. It was Mark. "Julia, can we talk?" "I miss us," he said, his voice sounding anguished. She hesitated but was no longer afraid. "Do you miss me, or do you miss your comfortable life?" she replied, with a coldness that surprised her. "I'm not interested in empty promises." Mark was silent, clearly not expecting this response. "I made a mistake, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix it." "Fix it? Do you want me to pretend nothing happened?" "That's not how it's going to work," Julia replied, determination growing within her. "I'm no longer the woman you left behind." He tried to argue, but Julia wasn't willing to listen. She hung up the phone, feeling a wave of relief and power. The life she knew was changing, and it excited her. One night, while browsing social media, Julia received a direct message from Sarah. "Can we meet? We need to talk about Mark. I believe we have a common enemy," the message read. Julia hesitated for a moment, but then anger and the need for justice pushed her to respond positively. The next day, they met in a discreet cafe, away from prying eyes. The atmosphere was cozy, with the aroma of coffee and fresh cakes filling the air. When they saw each other, a mix of tension and relief hung between them. "I didn't know you were married to him," Sarah began, her voice low and hesitant. "He deceived me, and I feel so guilty." "You're not the only victim here," Julia said, her voice firm but full of understanding. "I didn't come here to blame you, but to find out the truth." The two women shared stories, and gradually, the connection between them deepened. Julia realized that Sarah had valuable information about Mark, messages and details that could expose his lies. "We need to work together," Julia proposed, her gaze determined. "Together, we can put an end to this." Sarah agreed, her eyes shining with a new purpose. "I want him to pay for everything he's done. Let's do this." Julia felt warmth spreading through her body. At that moment, she was no longer a betrayed woman, but a warrior ready to face the battle. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly falling into place, and revenge was not just a way to punish Mark, but a way to rise up and regain control over her life. They left the cafe with a plan in mind, united by pain and the determination to expose the truth. Julia's life was changing, and she was increasingly ready to free herself from the chains that bound her. The journey was just beginning, and redemption had never seemed so close. Julia and Sarah met in a discreet cafe, away from prying eyes. The atmosphere was tense, but there was a new determination in both their eyes. They knew that the next stage of their plan would require courage and strategy. With a laptop open in front of her, Julia quickly typed Mark's email password, while Sarah watched with a mix of anxiety and excitement. "Are you sure he won't notice that something is going on?" Sarah asked, her voice low, almost a whisper. "I changed the password a few days ago. He never pays much attention to what I do." Julia replied, looking at the screen as the inbox began to load. "We need to be quick." As soon as the email opened, a series of messages appeared. Julia began scrolling through the screen, and her heart pounded when she found a conversation between Mark and another woman, dated weeks ago. The words were sweet, full of promises of love and commitments she had never known about. Anger and sadness mixed in her chest. "Look at this." Julia turned the screen to Sarah, pointing to the messages. "He talks about me as if I were a burden, and this woman, she doesn't even know he's married." Sarah, with a look of compassion and indignation, read the messages. "He's a manipulator, not just with you, but with all the women who come into his life. We need to use this to our advantage." With a plan in mind, the two women began to note down everything they could use as evidence. Each message, each date, everything was crucial to unmask the farce that Mark had built. Time passed quickly, and adrenaline was pumping through their veins. The following night, Mark's work party was underway. Julia and Sarah arrived together, disguised under smiles and elegant clothes, but an electric tension surrounded them. It was clear that Julia was nervous. What she was about to do could radically change her life, but she also felt a sense of freedom. Confronting Mark in front of his colleagues was an act of reclaiming her own life. "Are you ready?" Sarah asked as they waited for Mark to arrive, ready to finally expose the truth. Julia replied firmly as she looked at the crowd gathered around the bar. When Mark finally appeared, his smile was radiant, but when he saw Julia and Sarah together, his expression changed to one of confusion and surprise. Julia took a deep breath and signaled to Sarah, who nodded back, confirming that she was by her side. "Mark," Julia called him, with a voice that didn't waver with emotion. Everyone turned to them. "We need to talk." "What's going on?" Mark asked, worry beginning to creep into his tone. "I have something you need to see," Julia said, pulling out the laptop that was hidden under the table. The murmur of the crowd grew as she opened the screen and projected the messages on the wall. "What's this?" Mark stammered, as the faces around him became more and more curious. "These are your messages, Mark." Julia spoke, her voice firm. "Messages you exchanged with other women while you were cheating on me." A heavy silence fell over the room. Julia could see the color drain from Mark's face and the disbelief in his colleagues' expressions. Shame began to spread like an ink stain on a white cloth. "Julia, this isn't what it looks like," he tried to argue, but his voice sounded weak, as if he knew there was no escape. "Isn't it? Then tell me, Mark, who is this woman?" Julia gestured to Sarah, who was beside her, and the crowd turned toward her. "She's the mistress you hid from me. And now, everyone here knows the truth about the man you really are." Mark was paralyzed, his words failing him, and the disapproving looks grew more intense. Julia felt the adrenaline surging through her body. This was her time to shine, to free herself from the chains that tied her to a life of lies. As the party turned into a frenzy, she turned to Sarah, who looked at her approvingly. They had done it. The truth was out, and nothing could be more liberating than that moment. Julia knew that, no matter what happened from that point on, she had reclaimed her power. With Mark's reputation in shreds and the truth exposed, Julia felt that a new chapter was about to begin. He may have torn down her world, but now, finally, she was free to build a new one. A determined smile formed on her lips. Revenge wasn't just about punishment, it was about finding peace and freedom. And that, Julia had found. Now, I want you to think. How many times have you ignored the signs, turned a blind eye to suspicious behaviors, all in the name of a love that seemed perfect? Is it worth keeping someone by your side who doesn't respect what you've built together? Learning to deal with the pain of betrayal might be the key to strengthening yourself and choosing a healthier path for your future. And you, have you ever gone through something similar? How did you deal with the situation? Share your story in the comments. I want to hear about it. And if this story made you reflect, take a moment to click on the video appearing on your screen right now. In my opinion, it's one of the best stories I've ever told. And if you liked what you just heard, you'll definitely enjoy this other story too. So subscribe to the channel, click on the video on your screen now, and I'll see you in a few seconds.